In Canada, husband wakes up from coma to kill his wife with Vase, true crime. The room was quiet, too quiet. The steady beep of the heart monitor, a soft reminder of life, still hanging by a thread. John's eyes flickered open. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed too bright, too cold. He was disoriented, unsure of where he was. His body felt heavy, as if it belonged to someone else. His mind, however, was sharper than ever. The events before the coma fragments. A car crash. A blur of sirens. Then nothing. But now, as his mind cleared, there was something else. A pull, a strange, instinctive urgency. A memory. He turned his head, slowly, towards the corner of the room. His wife, Maria, sat in the chair beside him, her eyes closed, a soft smile playing on her lips. The scent of her perfume was faint but familiar. He wanted to speak, to reach out, but his body betrayed him. His muscles ached like they hadn't moved in years. Suddenly, a strange coldness gripped him. It wasn't just the hospital air. It was something deeper, something darker. A thought, unbidden and terrifying, began to rise within him. The vase. The vase on the nightstand. He looked at it. For a moment, it seemed like the only thing in the room. His heart pounded. His mind raced. What was he thinking? Why was it so clear, so urgent? Without warning, his hand reached out. Slow. Controlled. As if the vase was calling to him. The porcelain was cool against his fingertips. He grasped it. It felt right. It felt like destiny. Maria stirred slightly, still unaware. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, a gentle rhythm. But to John, every sound felt magnified, every heartbeat echoing louder than the last. A whisper of air rushed past him. The room was suffocating. He could barely think. Just the vase, the weight of it in his hand, growing heavier with every second. His vision blurred. He stared at his wife, and something changed in his eyes. A dark, cold resolve. His grip tightened on the vase. Maria, still unaware, hummed softly to herself. The sound pierced John's mind, driving him mad. Without thinking, he swung the vase. The shattering sound echoed in the room, sharp and final. Maria's scream cut through the air. But it was too late. The world seemed to freeze. The vase, now broken, lay at his feet. John's breathing was shallow as he stood over his wife. Her lifeless eyes stared back at him, filled with shock, filled with horror. And John, he didn't feel remorse, only silence. In the blink of an eye, everything had changed. A coma-induced madness or something darker. The truth was never clear. But the moment of shock would haunt the hospital forever. The room was still. The faint hum of machines, the only sound breaking the silence. John stood there, frozen. His mind was a blur, trying to comprehend what he had just done. But there was no turning back. His hand still gripped the broken vase, the sharp edge digging into his palm. The blood on the floor spread slowly, staining the white tiles. Maria's body lay motionless, her face a mask of terror. The scent of her perfume was now mixed with a coppery tang of blood. John's senses were heightened. The sound of his own breath seemed deafening in his ears. The harsh reality was sinking in. His legs trembled, and he staggered back, almost collapsing against the wall. The room spun. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but he couldn't. The cold grip of guilt began to creep in, but it wasn't as strong as the strange feeling he'd had earlier. It was something darker, something primal. He felt a wave of nausea, but it wasn't from the blood. It was something else, a pull he couldn't explain, a disconnect from reality. In the distance, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted him back into awareness. He quickly turned and, for a brief moment, considered fleeing. But something stopped him. The thought of leaving her like this unfinished didn't sit right. With trembling hands, he placed the broken vase back on the nightstand. The shards of porcelain scattered like broken dreams. As the door swung open, the nurse entered. Her face turned pale the moment she saw the scene. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp, eyes wide with horror. But John was already gone. The room was no longer his. His mind had taken him somewhere else, somewhere far from reality, somewhere he would never return from. The nurse's scream pierced the air, but it barely reached John's ears. His feet moved on their own, like they had a mind of their own. He stumbled out of the room, heart pounding in his chest. The hospital hallways seemed endless, a maze of sterile walls and flickering lights. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. It was as though he were being pulled forward, drawn by an invisible force. The sounds around him blurred into a low hum, the distant murmur of voices, the clicking of medical equipment. But it all felt distant, out of reach. None of it mattered. His pulse raced, his body acting without thought, driven by something darker, deeper. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. His hands were covered in blood. His mind, clouded with confusion, couldn't process what he had just done. But there was no escape. There was only the path ahead, and something inside him told him to keep walking. The door to the emergency exit creaked as he pushed it open. The cold night air hit his face like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. He stepped outside, the world beyond the hospital a blur of lights and shadows. He could hear the faint sirens in the distance, but they seemed so far away, like they didn't concern him. His breathing was ragged, each inhale shallow, as if the weight of his actions were suffocating him. Yet, there was no remorse, no guilt, only a strange emptiness that seemed to consume him from the inside. John stood there, motionless, as the world around him continued to turn. The stars above twinkled coldly in the night sky, indifferent to the horror he had just unleashed. And somewhere, in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. For John had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The man who had once loved his wife was gone. In his place stood something unrecognizable, something driven by madness, by darkness, by something far more terrifying. The truth of that night would haunt the hospital for years, but would haunt John even more, for he would never escape the nightmare he had become. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the cold night air. John stood frozen, staring at the empty street ahead, his mind a whirl of thoughts that didn't make sense. Every passing second felt like a decade, stretching time in ways he couldn't understand. His hands, still slick with blood, trembled uncontrollably. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. The night seemed to close in on him, the darkness pressing against his chest, suffocating him. It was as though the world had shifted, and he no longer belonged in it. Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps echoed, quick and heavy. A figure emerged from the shadows, a police officer, moving toward him with purpose. John didn't react. He didn't run. He didn't even turn around. It was as though he had already accepted the fate that awaited him. The officer reached him, hand outstretched. "Sir, you need to stop," the officer called out, his voice steady but tense. John's body didn't respond. His eyes locked on the officer, but there was nothing in them. No recognition, no fear. Just emptiness. The officer hesitated, sensing something was horribly wrong. But before he could reach for his radio, John's voice broke the silence. "Why didn't you stop me?" he whispered, his words barely audible in the cold air. The officer froze, confused by the question. "Sir, what are you talking about? You need to come with me." But John just shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. "It's too late for that." The officer's hand shot out to grab him, but it was too late. John collapsed to his knees, the weight of his actions finally hitting him. But even as he broke down, there was no relief, no sense of release. He had taken a life, his wife's life, and in doing so, he had destroyed whatever was left of his own. The officer knelt beside him, handcuffing him without saying a word. The sirens blared louder now, drawing closer. But John didn't hear them. He didn't hear anything. All he could feel was the cold, the bone-deep chill that came not from the night air, but from the very depths of his soul. The darkness had taken him, and there was no light left to guide him back. As the officer pulled him to his feet, John's legs buckled beneath him. He didn't resist. There was no fight left in him. His mind, once full of thoughts, now felt numb, as if it had shut down entirely. The world around him was a blur of flashing lights and hurried voices. His eyes were vacant, staring at nothing in particular, as though he were trapped in a place where time no longer existed. The officer led him to the police car, the weight of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. John didn't care. He barely noticed the pain. As they reached the car, he was shoved into the back seat, the cold metal against his skin doing little to jar him from the fog that had overtaken his mind. The doors slammed shut. Inside the car, there was silence, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the officer's radio. John's thoughts wandered aimlessly. His wife's face, her beautiful, kind face, flashed before his eyes. But it wasn't the image of her he remembered. No. Instead, it was the look of terror that had been frozen on her face in those final moments. The blood on her hands. Her voice, pleading, had filled the air just before the vase hit her. He couldn't escape it. The image burned itself into his mind, a scar that would never heal. As they drove through the darkened streets, John's world was no longer confined to the hospital or the police car. His mind was trapped in the chaos of what he had done, the crushing weight of a decision he couldn't understand but couldn't undo. The sirens that had followed him since he left the hospital now seemed like a distant echo, drowned out by the roar in his mind. A part of him wanted to scream. A part of him wanted to beg for forgiveness. But there was no one to hear him. There was no one left. When they arrived at the station, John was pulled from the car and led through the doors. The lights in the hallway flickered as if reluctant to shine on the man who had once been a husband, a man with a future, now reduced to a monster. He was placed in a holding cell, the cold walls pressing in on him from every side. For the first time since the incident, John's breath caught in his throat. The reality of what he had done hit him with full force, and his chest tightened in a way he couldn't escape. But even then, even in the quiet of the cell, there was something in him that still didn't fully understand. Had he truly meant to kill her? Had it been the coma? The madness? Or was he simply a man who had always been capable of such darkness, hidden beneath the surface until that fateful moment? The questions filled his mind, but there was no answer. Only silence. And that silence, that cold, unrelenting silence, would follow him for the rest of his life. As John sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, time seemed to stretch infinitely. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shadows on the concrete floor. He stared at the small window, but all he could see was darkness beyond it. The silence was deafening. It wasn't just the quiet of the room. It was the silence of his own mind. A void where thoughts once lived, now replaced with an overwhelming emptiness. He wanted to cry out, to break the silence with some form of release, but no words came. No tears. He was numb, completely disconnected from the world around him. The only sound that broke the stillness was the occasional shuffle of feet in the hallway outside. Footsteps that reminded him that the world had moved on. But he remained trapped in this moment, forever suspended between his past and the unforgivable act he had committed. He thought of Maria again, her smile, her voice, the warmth of her touch. But the memory was now tainted, replaced by the image of her final moments. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the image flashed in his mind. Her wide, horrified eyes staring up at him, as if begging for a chance to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it, no erasing the horror of that moment. John's hands shook uncontrollably, and for the first time, he felt a tremor of fear. Not for what was coming, but for himself. Who had he become? What had he done? Was he still the man he had been before? Or was he now something else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at him, pulling at the very fabric of his being. Suddenly, the sound of keys jangling interrupted his thoughts. The door to the holding cell creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside. John didn't move, didn't even look up. He was too far gone to care anymore. The officer spoke, his voice soft yet firm. "John, it's time to talk." John didn't respond. He couldn't. The officer waited a moment, but when John remained silent, he stepped forward. "John, we need to know what happened that night. We need to understand why." John's chest tightened at the question. Why? He didn't have an answer. He had no idea why. All he could feel was the crushing weight of his own guilt, the suffocating pressure of the actions that had led him to this point. The officer stepped closer, trying to meet John's eyes, but he couldn't. John's gaze was locked on the floor, staring at the reflection of his blood-stained hands in the shiny surface beneath him. "Do you remember?" the officer asked again, his voice softer now. John nodded slowly, though his mind was a blur. He didn't remember all the details, but he remembered enough. He remembered the vase, the shattering sound, the scream. But most of all, he remembered the emptiness, the hollow feeling that had settled inside him the moment he struck her. "I don't know," John finally whispered. "I don't know why." The officer's face softened slightly, but there was no pity in his eyes. Only a quiet understanding, the kind that comes from dealing with the worst of humanity. John's hands were still trembling as he lifted them to his face, rubbing his eyes in a futile attempt to block out the memories. But the truth was inescapable. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. John was alone again, with nothing but his thoughts, his guilt, and the terrible knowledge that there was no redemption for him. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in the depths of his soul, he knew there was no escape from the monster he had become. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. John remained in his cell, alone with the weight of his actions. He had been left to face his own thoughts, his own guilt, and there was no escape, no distraction. Time felt irrelevant now. The hours blurred together, an indistinguishable haze of cold stone walls and the constant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. His mind replayed the night over and over, a loop of horror he couldn't break. The image of Maria's face, her eyes wide with terror, haunted him like a relentless shadow. It wouldn't leave. Each time he closed his eyes, it was as if he were trapped in that moment again, that horrifying split second when he swung the vase. He could hear the sickening thud, the shatter of porcelain, the scream that echoed in his ears. He didn't know how much time had passed when the door to his cell opened once more. But this time it wasn't an officer. A woman stepped inside, her expression cold, professional. Detective Thompson. John barely looked up, his eyes heavy, vacant. Her gaze swept over him with a practiced intensity. She didn't speak at first, but the weight of her presence was enough to draw John's attention. "John," she said, her voice calm but piercing. "We need to understand what happened." He looked at her, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't know what had happened, not really. His throat tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he spoke. "I don't know what I did. I don't know why I did it." Detective Thompson took a step closer, watching him closely. Was it the coma? Was it the trauma from the accident? John shook his head slowly. "I don't know. It felt like I woke up and something just clicked." Her eyes softened, but she didn't pity him. "John, it's important that we understand why. The truth will be the only thing that saves you from what's coming." John's heart pounded in his chest. He was suffocating. The walls of the cell seemed to close in even more, trapping him. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Save him from what was coming. Could there really be any salvation for what he had done? "Tell me about the night," she pressed, her voice gentle yet firm. His mind spun. He didn't want to remember. He didn't want to face the truth. But slowly, as the seconds passed, the words began to spill out. The memory of the night, of waking up, disoriented and confused. The vase, the coldness that took over, the uncontrollable urge to strike. "I didn't mean to. I didn't." His voice cracked, and the words trailed off. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Detective Thompson watched him, the expression on her face unreadable. But inside, she was calculating, piecing together the fragments of a story that didn't quite make sense. "You're going to have to face the consequences of your actions, John," she said quietly. "And that's something no one can escape." Her words stung like a slap. The realization hit him. There would be no running from this. John had taken a life, and now he would face the consequences of that choice, no matter how much he regretted it. The detective turned to leave, but before she closed the door, she paused. "John, I'm sorry, but there's no redemption in the past. The only way forward is through what you've done." The door shut with a heavy clang, and John was once again alone. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't just the emptiness of the room. It was the crushing weight of the truth settling in, a truth he would have to live with for the rest of his life. And in that silence, John understood something that had eluded him until now. There was no escape, no way to undo the past. He was a man trapped in his own nightmare, and all he had left was the dark, cold reality of what he had done. John sat motionless, the walls of his cell pressing in on him from all sides. The silence felt deafening now, heavier than ever. His thoughts were a swirling storm, a cacophony of guilt, confusion, and regret. It was all he could feel, all he could think about. The truth of what he had done was undeniable. No matter how much he wished to erase it, it was there, staring back at him like an inescapable reflection in a mirror. He had killed her, his wife, the woman he had promised to love and protect. And now she was gone. For the first time since the incident, a tear slipped down his cheek, unbidden. He wiped it away quickly, as if doing so might erase the vulnerability he had just revealed. The cold floor beneath him felt like a cruel reminder of the reality he couldn't escape. His entire life had been torn apart in an instant, and there was no mending it. The minutes dragged on, then hours. Each passing moment seemed to take him further from the person he once was. Was he even that man anymore? He thought of Maria again. The way she used to smile, the way they laughed together, the way her presence had always grounded him. Now, all that was left were the shattered pieces of a life they'd once shared. And in those pieces, he saw only one thing, his own destruction. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, snapping him out of his thoughts. This time, it wasn't the detective. It was someone else, someone he hadn't expected to see. The door opened slowly, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was his brother, Michael. Michael stepped inside, his eyes heavy with sorrow. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking at John with a mixture of disbelief and pain. John could see the confusion in Michael's eyes, the way he struggled to comprehend the man his brother had become. I don't know what to say," Michael finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. John didn't respond. He couldn't. Words felt pointless now. Michael moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "John, what happened? How could this happen?" John lifted his head, meeting Michael's gaze for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know anymore." Michael's hand trembled as he reached out, placing it on John's shoulder. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you get help before it was too late?" John shook his head, the weight of his brother's words crashing down on him. He had always been the one to keep things buried, to hide his struggles. But now, the truth was out, and there was no hiding from it. "I didn't know what to do," John murmured, his voice breaking. "I didn't know who to trust. I didn't even trust myself." Michael's eyes softened, but there was no forgiveness in them. "Not yet. You've got to face the consequences, John," Michael said quietly. "Maria's gone, and nothing will bring her back." The words struck John like a physical blow. He knew this, but hearing it from his brother, hearing the cold truth, made it even more unbearable. "I'm sorry," John whispered. "I'm so sorry." Michael took a step back, his face contorted with grief. "Sorry won't change anything now. Sorry won't bring her back." With that, Michael turned and walked out, leaving John alone once more. The door clicked shut behind him, and John was left with the echoes of his brother's words ringing in his ears. He was alone, truly alone now. And as the hours passed, the darkness outside seemed to swallow him whole. There was no redemption. There was no way back. Only the cold, endless silence. John's world had narrowed to the confines of his cold cell. The darkness outside, no longer merely a shadow, but a reflection of the void that had overtaken him. His mind continued to spiral, relentlessly trapped in the cycle of guilt, regret, and sorrow. He hadn't been able to save Maria, and now there was no one to save him. Time felt like it had stopped, yet in his heart, he could feel it slipping away, every second that passed only deepening the pit inside him. His body felt heavy, like the weight of the world had settled on his chest. He lay back against the cold wall, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts fragmented and disjointed. The door to his cell creaked open again, but John didn't move. He didn't care anymore who came or went. But this time, the figure that entered wasn't just an officer or a family member. It was someone who had the power to change everything, the prosecutor. Her presence in the doorway was commanding, her face unreadable as she stepped inside. "John," she began, her voice sharp yet controlled. "I've been assigned to your case." John barely acknowledged her. He wasn't sure if he cared about the trial, about anything. Maria was gone. That was all that mattered. But the prosecutor continued, her words precise, almost surgical. "I need you to help me understand what happened that night. What led to the murder of your wife?" John swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was drowning in the gravity of his own actions. "I don't know what happened," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why it happened." The prosecutor studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity, then stepped closer. "You need to help me here, John. The truth matters now. Tell me about that night." John closed his eyes, the memory creeping back, vivid and haunting. The way he'd woken up, disoriented and fragile, with his mind clouded. The strange compulsion to do something, to act, even though he couldn't explain why. "The vase," he murmured. "It was the vase. I don't know why I just picked it up and everything went black after that." The prosecutor leaned in, her voice softer now. "Was it the coma? Was it the accident? Was there something that made you do this?" John could only shake his head slowly. "I don't know," he whispered, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "I wish I could explain, but I can't." The prosecutor stood in silence for a moment, considering his words. Then she nodded, as if understanding that there was no easy answer here. "You'll have to face the consequences, John. And in the end, the only thing you'll have is the truth. But it's a truth that will follow you for the rest of your life." John looked at her then, his gaze hollow and distant. The prosecutor was right. There was no escaping the truth. She turned and left without another word, leaving John alone once more. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence returned. This time, though, it was different. It was no longer just an empty room or the absence of sound. It was the weight of his own decisions pressing down on him, suffocating him, like a tomb. The truth had been spoken, but it didn't bring any relief. It was too late for redemption, too late for anything. John lay back against the wall, his body feeling like it was made of lead. The cold, unrelenting darkness outside pressed in even harder, and he knew, deep in his heart, that he had condemned himself. There was no going back. And in the stillness of that moment, John finally understood that the punishment was not just the prison he would soon be sent to. The real punishment was the one he had been living with from the moment he struck her. A lifetime of regret. As the hours dragged on, John's mind became more like a prison than the cell itself. Each thought was a chain, each memory a barb digging deeper into his soul. The guilt that had initially been sharp, overwhelming, had now dulled into something more suffocating, an ever-present weight pressing on his chest. He thought about Maria constantly, the soft laughter they once shared, the quiet mornings, the warmth of her touch. Now, those memories were nothing but ghosts, fleeting and intangible. John's eyes moved to the small window in the corner of the room, the only source of light. The sky had darkened, the stars faintly visible in the distant night. He wondered if the night would ever feel different. Would he ever see the world the same way again? The days had become a blur, a monotonous series of interrogations, questions, and unyielding silence. But nothing could change what had already happened. He couldn't shake the image of Maria's face when the vase hit her. Her wide, terrified eyes, the shock and betrayal that flashed in them as her life slipped away. It was like a broken record, replaying over and over, louder and louder in his mind. At times, it felt like he was losing his grip on reality. His thoughts were fragments, pieces scattered across a landscape he could no longer navigate. The guards had stopped checking on him as often. He was left alone, with only his memories and the walls to keep him company. And with that loneliness, a deep despair settled in. He no longer cared about what was happening outside these walls. The trial, the verdict, they all seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what he had done. It was as if he had sealed his own fate the moment the vase shattered. In the stillness, John found himself talking to the shadows. Why? He would whisper, sometimes aloud, sometimes just in his mind. Why did it have to be her? But there were no answers. Only the oppressive silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the relentless ticking of time. He had no one to blame but himself. And that truth was the cruelest punishment of all. One night, a guard came to his cell, unlocking the door with a slow, deliberate motion. John barely looked up. It was another officer, but this one was different. Her face was unfamiliar, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. "John," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "It's time." John didn't react. He was beyond reacting. The realization that the end was near didn't bring any comfort. Instead, he felt a numbness settle deeper within him. The consequences were inevitable. His fate had already been sealed the moment he picked up that vase. As the officer led him down the dimly lit hallway, John's mind was empty, but his heart was heavy. Every step felt like it took him further away from the man he once was and closer to the man he could never escape. The weight of the trial, the guilt, the years to come, they all loomed over him. He had taken a life, and now, the rest of his life would be spent trying to reckon with it. The doors to the courtroom loomed ahead, cold and imposing. John's legs felt like lead as he was escorted inside. There, in the midst of the crowd, sat faces he didn't recognize, but he felt their eyes on him like 1,000 judging gazes. Maria's face was the only one that truly mattered now, and she was gone. The trial began, but John didn't hear the words. He wasn't paying attention. He was lost in his own thoughts, drowning in his own remorse. Nothing they said could change the truth. Nothing could take away the weight of what he had done. And as the prosecutor stood before the judge, speaking of justice and consequences, John finally understood. Justice would come in whatever form it would take. But the punishment had already begun, long before the trial, long before the sentence. It had started the moment the vase shattered. And it would never end. John's fate was sealed not by the verdict of the court, but by the irreversible truth of his actions. There was no escape, not from the prison of his mind, not from the haunting memory of what he had done. The trial, the years in prison, they were nothing compared to the lifetime of regret that would follow him. And so, as the courtroom buzzed with voices, John sat in silence, waiting for the inevitable. Because in the end, it wasn't the law that would punish him the most. It was the truth he had to live with. As the cold, sterile walls of the prison swallowed him whole, John felt a suffocating pressure close in. The officers led him down the long, empty corridor, their footsteps echoing, the sound of chains clinking against stone. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if his body was sinking deeper into the abyss. He passed by countless other prisoners, their faces blank, emotionless. Perhaps they, too, were prisoners of their own making. But none of them had the weight of guilt that John carried. As they reached his cell, the door groaned open, and he was shoved inside. The space was small, bare, just a cot, a sink, a toilet. A harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering in the silence. John stepped in, his feet dragging, and the door slammed shut behind him. The sound reverberated through him, the finality of it sinking deep into his bones. This was it. This was his life now. He sat on the edge of the cot, his hands trembling. The coldness of the room seeped into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the freezing emptiness inside him. The silence in the cell was deafening, and the stillness gave him too much space to think, to relive the moment over and over again. His mind replayed Maria's final moments. The shock on her face, the terror, the disbelief. He had been the one to take her life. He couldn't stop seeing it, couldn't stop hearing the echoes of that moment. John buried his face in his hands, his breath ragged as he fought to suppress the tears threatening to spill. But they came anyway, slow, heavy, relentless. He was a monster, a man who had killed the one person he had promised to protect. The world outside was moving on, the trial was over, and justice was being served. But none of that mattered to John, because Maria would never walk through that door again. He would never hear her voice, never see her smile, never feel her touch. The darkness of the cell seemed to mirror the emptiness inside him. He couldn't escape it. And in that moment, he realized something truly horrifying. The punishment was never just the prison sentence. It was the torment of knowing that, no matter how much time passed, he would never be free from his own guilt. No bars, no walls, no chains could contain the prison he had created for himself. It was eternal. The light in the cell flickered again, casting long shadows across the floor. John stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, and walked to the small window in the corner of the room. Outside, the world was quiet. But inside him, the storm raged on. He had taken everything, his freedom, his future, and most painfully, Maria's life. There was no escaping it. John pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the small window, staring out at the darkened world beyond. The night sky was vast, a sea of black and stars, yet it felt so distant, so unreachable. He had once dreamed of escape, of freedom, of redemption. But now, those dreams were nothing more than fading memories, illusions. His future was a closed door, a cell with no end. His breath fogged up the glass, but he didn't move, didn't wipe it away. The cold, the emptiness, it was all he deserved. The silence of the prison pressed in on him again, as suffocating as the guilt that weighed him down. But in the stillness, John's mind wouldn't quiet. It couldn't. The images of Maria's face were seared into his memory. The last look she had given him, a mix of love, fear, and betrayal. The moment her life slipped away, he had caused that. He squeezed his eyes shut, the pain and regret almost unbearable. Why? Why had it come to this? Why hadn't he seen the signs, the warnings, the cracks in their relationship? But those questions, like all the others, were just ghosts. The truth had already been written, and it was a truth John couldn't escape. He dropped his hands to his sides, the weight of it all sinking deeper. Everything he had once taken for granted, love, family, security, had been shattered in an instant. It was his fault. The door to his cell creaked open, and John didn't look up. He didn't want to face anyone, not the guards, not the other prisoners. He was too far gone, too broken. But the officer who entered didn't say a word at first. She simply stood there, her silhouette casting a shadow in the doorway. John didn't care who it was. He just wanted to be left alone with his thoughts, with his torment. But then the officer spoke, her voice calm yet firm. "You're not alone, John." The words caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't understand. His mind was too clouded, too consumed by his own suffering. "What do you mean?" he asked hoarsely, finally turning to face her. The officer took a step forward, her gaze steady. "You've been given a sentence, but you haven't been forgotten. There are people who are willing to help you. If you let them." John's heart clenched at the words. Help? Was there truly help for him? He had done the unforgivable. What could anyone do to help him now? But the officer's eyes were soft, not full of judgment, but of something else. Something he hadn't seen in a long time. Empathy. John didn't respond. What could he say? What was left to say? The officer didn't push him further. She simply nodded and turned to leave, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as the door closed behind her. The silence returned, heavier than before. John let out a shaky breath and collapsed back onto the cot, his hands trembling. His body ached, but it wasn't just physical pain. It was the weight of his own remorse, the unbearable knowledge that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. No amount of time would ever undo what he had done. And yet, in the pit of his heart, he felt the faintest glimmer of something. A small, fragile seed of hope. Was it possible to change? Could he ever atone for the life he had taken? He didn't know. He didn't have the answers. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that redemption, however distant, might still be within reach. It wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't bring Maria back. But it might just give him a chance to live with himself again. And so, as the darkness of the cell closed in around him, John clung to that fragile hope. Because even in the most unforgiving of places, sometimes that was all you could hold on to. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, John's existence remained confined to the small, cold cell. His routine had become predictable. The haunting silence, the clinking of chains, the occasional visit from a guard. But most of the time, he was left alone with his thoughts. The guilt that had once consumed him still gnawed at his insides, but something had shifted. The faint hope that had taken root within him was no longer as fragile as it once had been. He had begun to reflect on his actions, not just in terms of the crime, but in terms of who he had been, the man he was before everything had shattered. His thoughts turned inward, questioning the choices that had led him to that devastating moment. Slowly, he began to understand the depths of his own darkness. It wasn't just the act that he had to reconcile with, but the person he had been, the choices he had made, the life he had taken for granted. One day, as John sat on his cot, staring out at the distant horizon through the small window, a thought flickered through his mind. Could he be better? Could he find some semblance of peace within himself? The notion felt almost foreign, but it was there. It wasn't forgiveness from others that he needed. It was the forgiveness of himself. John began participating in the prison's rehabilitation programs. At first, it was difficult, the shame almost too heavy to bear. But over time, he found a small measure of solace in the stories of others, in the shared experiences of pain and remorse. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than despair. Not hope, but the possibility of healing. The road ahead was long, but as John lay down in his cell that night, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the man he had been didn't have to be the man he would always be. It was a small thought, but it was enough to carry him through the dark nights. Perhaps redemption wasn't something he could fully grasp, but the journey, the willingness to try, was what mattered most. And with that, he closed his eyes, not in peace, but in the quiet acceptance that the path to atonement would be a lifelong one. The rest of his days might be spent seeking redemption, but it was a journey he was finally ready to take.